And welcome everyone to the first of 4 panels that will comprise Blackboxing Banham. Anthony Vidler got us off to a great start last night, and the discussions that followed between Tony, Lydia Kallipoliti, Dora Epstein-Jones, and myself has already put some very interesting questions on the table. So we're looking forward to keeping those going today. Today, Benjy Flowers of the Knowlton School will serve as MC for 3 talks and a discussion with John Davis of the Knowlton School, Lydia Kallipoliti of the Cooper Union, and Hadas Steiner of the University of Buffalo. Now, before we begin, just a bit of orienting information. And now I realize I had some slides I would show, and I'm going to do that. Just 1 second. Now we're in business. So before I begin, just a bit of orienting information. Each of the 4 sessions will include 3 20-minute papers and a 30-minute discussion. We invite viewers to submit questions to the live chat, which is on YouTube. Moderators will monitor those chat windows as we proceed. Now, we understand that some of our audience, and maybe even some of the presenters, will watch at least some of the event asynchronously. So each session will immediately be posted to Knowlton's YouTube page. You can find all the necessary links at the URL on the screen, knowlton.osu.edu/blackboxing. We encourage presenters and audience members alike to make use of the comment section on YouTube between and during sessions, in the hopes that a robust conversation can emerge there as well. Now, as you can see from the posters, we've loosely grouped the panels for this conference under the heading Structures and Environments. So today we'll be with Structures number 1. And while these titles, and you can see these are here's where we're starting. Structures 1 today, Environments 1 on Saturday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Structures 2 back here 1 week from today at 3 o'clock on Thursday, March 4th, and Environments 2 the following Saturday, March 6th. Now you can see from these categories that we are drawing on Banham's usage of these terms, but it's important to know that in thinking about structures and environments, we're thinking of these terms very broadly. Megastructures, historical structures, pneumatic structures, rhetorical structures, all are fair game. Ditto for environments, well-tempered or otherwise. Of course, with these terms, we're also trying to hint at the persistent dialectical structures that exist throughout Banham's writings, those such as aesthetics and ethics, style and performance, tradition and technology, etc. We're particularly interested in how, in many cases, these dialectics sometimes fail to hold up. For example, should we consider Francois Delagre's famous environment bubble, which accompanied Banham's equally famous essay, A Home is Not a House, as an environment or a structure? It seems comfortably either, or perhaps neither. Ditto for megastructures. If we keep scaling up, say, to the scale of a region, or of a planet, does it still make sense to call it a structure? What if we scale down to a cushicle? At what point do the concepts structures and environments, which pervade Banham's writings and often color the work of this symposium's participants, at what point do those terms curl back upon one another? What's gained and lost in the terminological choices that we make? Banham, for his part, through this symposium, becomes a kind of touchstone or barometer, depending on where you fall on the tradition-technology spectrum, against which we will attempt to measure current conversations in history, theory, and design. How often that kind of measurement takes place and how useful it proves to be are among the questions we hope that will be taken up over the course of this event. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's panelists. John Davis is an architectural and environmental historian and assistant professor of landscape architecture at the Knowlton School. He works on technology, construction, and the environment in the Americas and is co-editor of the soon-to-be-released Military Landscapes. John holds degrees in architecture and landscape architecture from Harvard, where he also completed a PhD in architectural history and theory. Lydia Kallipoliti is an architect, engineer, and scholar, and assistant professor of architecture at the Cooper Union. Previously, she's taught at RPI, Syracuse, and Columbia. Lydia works at the unpredictable crossroads of architecture, technology, and environmental politics, and has produced a string of essays, exhibitions, and her latest book is called The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit? Hadas Steiner is associate professor of architecture at the University of Buffalo. Her research concentrates on the cross-pollination of technological, scientific, and cultural aspects of architectural fabrication in the post-war world, and recently has turned her attention toward the complex operation of terms like habitat and ecology in 20th century architectural culture. She's the author of numerous scholarly essays in the excellent book, Beyond Archigram, The Structure of Circulation. Our moderator today will be Benjy Flowers. Benjy is professor of architecture and associate director of the Knowlton School. His research examines architecture as a form of social activity, using major building types, including skyscrapers and stadia, to illuminate the cultural, political, and economic implications of architecture, and issues of race and class to inform the production and reception of architecture in the city, as well as the field's self-construction as a discipline. His many books include Beautiful Moves, Designing Stadia, Sport and Architecture, and Skyscraper, The Politics and Power of Building New York in the 20th Century. So we have a great lineup in store for today. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, turn the share privileges over to John Davis, and we will get started. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Todd. Okay. So again, thank you, Todd, for inviting me, to Michael as well for inviting me. It's very kind of exciting to revisit a lot of Rainer Banham that I hadn't looked at in quite a while. In the 1997 novel Underworld, Don DeLillo's protagonist describes his rental car crossing the desert of the American Southwest as, quote, a culmination in a way. A product of technical and ideological labor, vast in scope and reaching far into the United States' past, the nondescript sedan sat at the end of a long effort, only then becoming, quote, a natural match for the landscape I was crossing. The speed, the bled-white sky, the alienation of the desert travel, all this made for a moment where machine and landscape could meet at some abstract apex, a previously unseen fitting. Rainer Banham, today's protagonist, documented a series of similar realizations in his work on the American landscape, especially in the last decade of his life. America Deserta was where the culminations that structured his philosophy of history could become visible. Here we go. Banham, the philosopher of history, is my object today, and I want to deal with him on historians' terms. He may not have indulged in the paranoid sublime of DeLillo or Thomas Pynchon, but in the Mojave, he indeed constructed a framework to capture the weirdness of modernity's legacy. America existed in an unarticulated state. Big spaces, distended structures, big technical ambitions, big gaps in between. At the juncture of this inscrutable fitting between gizmo and vastness, Banham situated an architectural history of the anonymous avant-garde of machines and lifestyles that lurched forward in time, seemingly under its own power. The desert landscape provided a space to see the business end of these culminations, both as discrete technical systems and as landscape and the landscape qualities that supported them. Banham played the part with panache, a kind of groovy Burckhardt, surveying the vast plain and getting really enthusiastic about the sparse constellation of objects therein that could construct an age. His organizing historiographical idea was present in astounding qualities. Machine ages were in process in the desert and apparent. Weapons designers and fields of rotating satellite dishes, ritual objects in his lifelong historicist project. I should say now that I use historicist in a very, very different way than Tony Vidler was using it last night. I'm not talking about it in the art historical sense of, you know, quoting past styles. I'm referring to it as the kind of philosophy of history, the idea that history is going somewhere. or there's kind of a groundswell, a movement within history. More on that later. The American landscape was large enough and engineered enough that he could sidestep the landmines of Palladianism set up on the East Coast beachhead. In the desert landscape, he found a sidewinding pathway to the artificial liberations of American exceptionalism. Crucially, it was in the fully engineered landscape, not natural landscape, that fulfilled his desire for refreshed historicism, one that could fit an envirotechnical maelstrom whose first warning signs emanated from beyond the 100th meridian. Banham's career coincided with the return of the familiar exhaustion in architectural theory. He lived and worked at a time of technological shifts, and the taking of sides occupied much of the discourse. In the 18th century, when engineering emerged as a distinct discipline and the battle for control over space, types of space, and forms exposed a sclerotic theoretical operation, the engineer's practice and sense of mission offered a refuge from the daunting emptiness that classical concerns of order seemed to feel beneath their feet. Banham relished engineering's imperviousness to iconographic analysis and, as has been well documented, allowed himself the freedom to distinguish himself from his Liebermeister Pevsner. Consumer industrialism provided plenty of new playing fields. Banham's perpetual search for new pioneers out there hewing the future led him to a vast landscape of industrial interdependence, where product design, production, delivery, reception, modification, hot rodding, and fantasy existed in complex ecology. The sheer immensity of America supplemented the sense of that future's inevitability, its imminent arrival. America did not perhaps originally inoculate Banham against any shame at being forthrightly historicist, but it certainly supplemented his immunity. As Nigel Whiteley argued, Banham came to a point in his career where he didn't care if his historical syntheses were falsifiable, and he even defended Pevsner against the lobbed attacks that his work was suspect because it focused on modernism's progress. To Banham, fervent belief in the actual positing of something would always supersede any anxiety or hand-wringing about supposed objectivity. The mission, too, allowed Banham to avoid exhausting agonizing over his avowed enemy, crypto-classicism, dispatching the modernists' adoration of car photography as so much superficial misunderstanding and technical ignorance in theory and design in the first machine age. Banham was free to, on arrival in America, sidestep the scattered Palladianisms around the landscape, or at least concentrate his efforts on parts of the landscape that wouldn't bog him down in vulgar agrarianism or unwittingly embed him in communities of reactionaries. "Mine eyes dazzled, my sensibility was transfixed," he wrote about his encounter with the Mojave in California. "My consciousness transformed." We might forgive him for this rhetoric, accessing a curious interest in Protestant tropes of revelation and revival that appear from time to time elsewhere in his work. It's much more likely that his sensibility was not transfixed, but confirmed. "I dig the landscape more than most art forms," Banham writes in his essay on the British landscape designers William Kent and Capability Brown. The essay, one of the few in which Banham concentrates exclusively on landscape, is notable because he names both his enthusiasm and his notion that Palladianism is not constrained to architecture, but can bleed out into its surroundings. With little love shown for either Brown or Kent, Banham uses the essay to arrive at a near complete admiration for the resolutely pure aesthetic experience to be had at Stourhead. Built over 20 years by the banker and landscape amateur Henry Hoare, Banham found Stourhead's compelling power to be that in that it was drained of all supposed duties to allegory or illusion. Banham's location of himself in a landscape that allowed him to receive and communicate something about experiential totality that is more easily achievable in a landscape than a set of architectures and products, or even an individual building, in a disconnected historical view. Landscapes provided Banham with the first culmination, an ability to find purity in a heterogeneous and heterodox environment, and speak about it without subjecting one's method to accusations of inorganic eclecticism. Like many aspects of his work, Banham's lifelong identity as an engineer, even if it was subconscious or suppressed at times, affected his impulse to see landscapes as unified and syncretic organizations of thought. With characteristic lightness and humor, Banham approached projects on the landscape scale end of engineering with the same desire to humanize and embrace technical advancement. He returned several times to the Tennessee Valley Authority in his writings, testing out different ways to extract the social dimensions of the authoring zeitgeist from a regional hydroelectrical authority and fertilizer co-op. In a lecture given in the 80s, Banham described the assemblage of TVA structures and landscapes as a, quote, user-friendly apparatus of massive scale, even going so far as to gently poke fun at Teferi by asking him to behold the dirigiste utopia beyond the Italians' wildest dreams in the heart of America. In the Tennessee Valley, Banham's need to hold on to the iconology of his Courtauld training seems to loosen. In his first article on the Valley of the Dams, he subjects the bold sans serif imprint of Hiawassee, impressed into the dam's concrete face, to his familiar mode of interpretation as a means of anticipating an immediate future. Eventually, he abandons this narrow method in favor of looking at the, quote, relaxed, benign, and prosperous vision of utopia as a whole. Banham saw the power of TVA in its inculcation of an almost religious belief in the valley's people. The project's constituents came to have faith in the notion that the river worked for the people, told in totality because of the self-evident sprawl of the engineering complex. This represents a crucial development in Banham's attitude towards landscape. At TVA, one could apprehend the sustaining, raw relationship of a territory's power, channeled through engineering and related to an organism's space. Attention to an applied symbolic hierarchy of that power's distribution wasn't necessary. Banham reported that his sense of beauty was that the sense that beauty was just, quote, just another iconography was thoroughly obliterated at some point on the highway near Espanola, New Mexico. The effect of this obliteration was to do a little deck clearing under the searing blueness of the sky. In America, Banham continued to approach all the new things under the sun with the same kind of gee whiz new journalism approach that had become his brand. The gizmo concept, focusing on the anonymous production of specialized machines that in turn profoundly changed their surrounding environment's suitability for human inhabitation, bridged architecture and gadgetry under the verb to design. But the object qualities of small things like Ole Evinrude's outboard engine or bronze radio held Banham's attention and collector's impulses. Pevsner's own encyclopedic compulsions are present again. It would be amusing to think how, given more time, Banham may have transmuted the buildings of England into a 46-volume Gizmos of America. Beyond the giddy technophilia, gizmo history has allowed Banham to advance in environmentalism. This aspect of his thought was not so much about ecological conservation, but instead consisted of a critical stance towards socio-technical land use practices, the second culmination I want to talk about today. Banham used gizmos to describe the aporia at the heart of contemporary criticism. Relying on Welland Davies's rock-bottom definition of architecture as that which changes land use, Banham lamented art history's inability to grapple with the most elemental sense of design. The Great Gizmo was indeed an alternative methodological vehicle out of art history, but it also, and more importantly, was a way to hunt his old foe classicism. The well-known Great Gizmo essay is essentially a critique of Jeffersonian Palladianism. Banham mocks a lazy ideological agrarianism that doesn't actually propose low-density living, but instead serves as a formidable solidification of landedness, enclosure, and aristocratic thinking. The classical arrangements of landscape spaces into barely reconstructed manors and plantations that underpins American agrarian landscape disposition meant that Americans are at risk of, quote, being pinned to the ground by vast masses of masonry, both literally and figuratively. Like many of his concepts, Banham's notion of environment remained protean and opportunistic. Gizmos forced the shape-shifting, referring to everything outside as, quote, an undifferentiated mess and, quote, an undifferentiated set of circumstances. Banham nonetheless appreciated the emergent mirage-like structures that appeared and vanished under landscape criticism. Confessing that he had, quote, learned to worry about the aesthetics of landscape in America, Banham located the source of his concern in the delicate and transient geometries that again defied iconographical analysis. The, quote, geometry of Darwinian survival, apparent in a climax community of Laria divaricata, a desert shrub commonly known as chaparral, spoke to the kind of radical, stochastic approach to indeterminate design that had been the subject of his megastructures investigation. While the landscape may have told him that he was indeed onto something, the scale of these revelations in turn describes an important facet of his environmentalism. The landscape's processes held its allure, and speaking about the forces at work in the landscape much beyond what could be experienced personally seemed to be of little interest to him. The third culmination was where these processes of differentiation, which could indeed be at a planetary scale, became an intelligible experience to him personally. Banham wrote of the desert landscape in terms of void and exposure, where phenomena, the weirder the better, could quickly fill and overwhelm one's perception, but then abandon the subject to rumination and reflection almost as quickly. The eerie light at the Great Soda Lake so resembled the Cherenkov light of lethal nuclear radiation that it arrested the critic and made him think of the desert's militarism. Ghostly mists and blaring heat liberated the quote, Protestant mind's eye, perhaps the Protestant unwillingly being him, enabling a full reception of the experience. Similar spectral presences, both natural and artificial, generated an image of a haunting expanse tethered to the real world by only thin lines of structure. Roads, landing strips, and a bit of architecture prepared the proscenium for the main player, the expanse itself, shot through with mind-bending occurrences. Pevsner never had the chance to encounter his zeitgeist peering through the form of a, quote, 5-foot disk of raw light 200 feet above one's head. But Banham did. The telescope at Kitt's Peak could only have such an effect on an individual, armored as Banham was, by severe literary proclivities and overeducation, because it was situated in a quote, landscape where nothing officially exists. Banham dismissed the work of both Michael Heiser and Robert Smithson as, quote, trifles, inadequate to a culture that was barreling towards a remaking of everything according to a different rationality. The form of his historicism, how he meant to capture the machine age's movements within history that could encode that liberated rationality. Stress testing history writing may well have been one of the driving forces behind his well-known graphomania. Doing history by exploding its methodological customs and constraints is parallel to writing about supposedly indescribable voids of unfathomable beauty. I'm in agreement with Todd Gannon in that I don't believe the contradiction or paradox was lost on Banham. His, quote, pure aesthetic experience in the American desert, of course, relied on a vast and carefully tuned iconoclasm, reflected in his meditations on Protestantism's fitting repose in the desert expanse, its, quote, symbolically proper abode. After reading so much of his writing again, and some for the first time in preparation for this talk, I can't help but think about what targets his weaponized but creative iconoclasm might have found had he dwelt longer in America and sank deeper into its complexities. What might have been made of the South? What would he have written about Katrina, about Ferguson? Would he have altered his thinking about the great American expanse when writing of Standing Rock? Banham's experience at Kitt Peak is a machine age experience cloaked in the trappings of a tongue-in-cheek religious experience. The purity of his epiphany comes from his correct identification of the fiery orb as a machine age culmination. I believe, tentatively, that Banham's historicism would have allowed him to avoid messy essentializing of landscape and society at New Orleans after Katrina, and instead would have pointed towards finding that culmination that, through writing, becomes cause. This might be his greatest gift to the rest of us historians, an unabashed desire to structure these culminations through a compulsively written history of something that has happened but is just only now about to be seen. Thank you very much. And I'm going to...
Should I go next? Yes? Okay, I'm sharing. Does it show, Shreya? Yeah? All good? Okay, so I guess I'm one of the people that considers the bubble as both structure and environment or neither. I'm gonna talk about the bubble and the ideology of the bubble, the way that it has lived on and the problems that it has incurred in time. And it's going to be a little bit of a reflection, like an anthropology of the present as well during the pandemic. So let me start. And thank you so much, Todd, for this really amazing invitation to be with incredible, brilliant colleagues. So during the clickbait of the pandemic crisis this past spring, the icon of the bubble, these are several images that have circulated through social media. So the bubble and protocols of decontamination have resurged with no return. House Wrecker Co.'s masks, balloons, and mind expanders, Coop Himmelblau's restless sphere in Basel, as well as the dome over Manhattan by Buckminster Fuller and Soja Sadao, have all become ultimate prophylactic spaces, organizations of containment and engineered safety. Bubbles are in many ways both emblems of climatic control and of the hygienic conception of a pure, disinfected atmosphere, one that is regimented and safeguarded for selected subjects. Our shared father figure in this venue, Rainer Banham, was quite explicit in announcing his famous environmental bubble with François Delegret, above all, as a hygienic project. The bubble was not only suggested as a medium of literacy in reading atmospheres literally, like quantified airflows, and these are his words from the well-tempered environment. It was also a medium of critiquing the purification of stale air. Even though Banham was nude and surrounded by machines that would unburden him from any kind of clothing within the so desired tempered environment, his fixation was on screening noxious atmospheric pollutants from the domestic interior. Banham's ardent advocacy in the 1960s for the conditioning of indoor air quality sprang from his voracious investigations in the evolution of building systems throughout the 19th century, determined almost exclusively by medical practitioners. Doctors were directly transferring their medical knowledge in the environmental management of airflows. In this light, the tempered interior was a remedial treatment in many ways to the pathology of unregulated airflow. Referencing Conrad Meyer in 1904, he wrote that early justifications of air conditioning were weaponized against excessive amounts of water vapor, sickly odors from respiratory organs, unclean teeth, perspiration, untidy clothing, the presence of microbes due to various conditions, stuffy air from dusty carpets, and draperies and other causes of discomfort and ill health. During the mid-19th century, the goal of improving public health, combined with a better understanding of air thermodynamic properties, impelled a foul, or as they called it, vitiated air, which was issued from one's lungs, was considered the main cause for human illness, responsible, according to some reports, for 40% of all deaths. Among the proponents of improved ventilation was Louis Leeds, a heating and ventilation engineer from Philadelphia and self-proclaimed health expert, who published in 1871 his treatise on ventilation based on lectures that he had given earlier at the Franklin Institute. In a striking alignment to today's analysis of coronavirus indoor transmission, as well as visualizations of super spreading events indoors, Leeds argued, and this is the cover of his book in the 19th century, that man's breath was his own worst enemy. In the same way as is argued today, natural ventilation would remove the diseased air. Leeds' method of representation was very original, and it was developed from glass lantern slides and lithographic illustrations of a little glass room. Inside, he showed the movement of air at different temperatures, with red representing heat or rarity, and blue coldness or density. The clouds of color were in many ways rudimentary representations of what we now call computational fluid dynamics, or CFD analysis, showing the conductive movement of hot and cold air and radiant heat flows. Leeds also drew diagrams of the oxygen proportion in the air, and the white boxes are the oxygen in the air, which accounted for 1/5 of the whole air and attested for the lack of oxygen that was directly reflected in the color of one's blood. A beautiful bright red if breathing pure air full of oxygen versus the dark, dull color evident when breathing impure air. To use the words of Susan Sontag, inhaling or floating pathogens leads to, and these are her words, disintegration, fibrillization, and dematerialization. It is the body turning to phlegm and mucus and sputum, and finally blood and of air, or of the need for better air. Despite the need for ventilation, nevertheless, that Leeds ardently supported in 1860, and infectious disease epidemiologists fervently call for in today's respiratory pandemic, Banham's bubble was sealed. It did not allow for exchange of incoming or outgoing air. I'm therefore arguing that Banham's idiosyncratic fascination with a bubble was at once a critique, a satire, and an effort to dismantle the object of enclosure, as it was a love affair with the pathology of disinfection, a pathology which has found refuge in the American ideal of comfort, the authority to control and regulate in an act of ultimate hubris one's atmospheric contents via mechanical ventilation systems. What remains a paradox is the fact that Banham's environmental bubble has surfaced as a sustainable design paradigm in controlling the atmosphere and therefore saving energy. With blockage from the mechanics of the exterior world and any adversity that such an encounter might entail with the outside, buildings have saved significant amounts of energy. And it is because of their numerical performance that they are esteemed environmentally favorable, reducing thermal loss. In light of this controversial conservationist ethic, the protective uterine environment of the bubble has been consistently translated as a conserved ecological milieu, blocked and safeguarded from the effluence of the exterior world. As he says, wash your hands and come back for the next paragraph. Bodies and biomes unpacked, the next position of the bubble. In our bubbles today, we have never been more viciously aware of our bodies in space. Bodies relative to other bodies, to objects touched by foreign hands. All physical relationships can be seen as networks of intersection. Within the premises of quarantine, bodies are unpacked. They're not simply discrete physical entities, but field distributions of droplets, germs, and pathogens within an expanded ambient environment. Transmission studies show with every motion, like breathing, talking, sneezing, are bodily byproducts that offset their own microecologies that reach every surface of the spaces that we occupy. This can certainly lead to illness, but not all building microecologies are harmful. After all, we are microbial entities, and therefore understanding how pathogens flow through different microclimates could have immediate applications in how we design indoor environmental systems. Arguably, the defensive separation of inside-outside cannot act as the exclusive protective measure against disease. Architect Ted Kruger suggests that interior plant-based phytoremediation, microbial mats used for water filtration, and other microbe-activated filtration media may enable us to coexist with other organisms and develop multiscale and multi-species spaces of interaction. The bubble, the ultimate protective medium against pathogens and illness, cannot save us. It is only an illusion of control that engenders a psychosocial interiority that sets its context apart from the outside world. A dirtier, more fuzzy reality of multi-species constituents might lead us to a new normality. This is what is conjectured by journalist Kyle Chaika in The New Yorker during the summer, where he envisioned how the pandemic would reshape architecture. He wrote that in the midst of social distancing, the spaces of confinement cannot be clean, sanitized, white, and smooth. In their place, we need to find a textured hideaway like an animal's den, full of reminders that the rest of the world still exists in all its faults, blemishes, and variations. So far, the role of building technology has been to insulate spaces from environmental flows, suggestive of a moral discipline that would protect buildings against disease, transferring an ideological framework of Protestant theology and ethics to the microrealm of materials. Nevertheless, in a new reality of interrelated crises, namely the public health crisis, climate change, and inequality, a new role may be cast to the notion of the environment, instead of it being the inactive, static, and historicized context within which an architectural object is placed. The environment can quite literally become the object of design itself. Position 2 on the bubble, isolated survival machines. Consider also this: the bubble, in protecting from danger, pollution, and disease, also operates as an existential medium of detachment for individuals or collectives from the urban fabric and the social sphere. Beyond a prophylactic, the bubble is a machine of calibration for the human and material capital inside the boundaries of its perimeter. In his recent article on the third pandemic wave, When Fear Surrenders to Global Melancholia, Slavoj Žižek cites Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, who claims, if we accept the measures against the pandemic, we thereby abandon open social space as the core of being human and turn into isolated survival machines controlled by science and technology, serving the state administration. With social distancing, our spatial mode of existence has been fundamentally altered. From Cartesian space, positioning locations in a finite XYZ system, to a spherical stereographic system referencing the self relative to other bodies in space. Determinant points of reference have faded in our cognition, while a new order of moving bodies has emerged in an interrelational metric game of proximity and field interactions. With social distancing as the solitary reliable measure, cultural anthropologist Edward Holl's proxemic theory looms very relevant. While in 1963, Holl's specificity in defining the limits of personal space in a quantifiable notation system was critiqued as partially deterministic, the spatial order that Holl has suggested, starting from the self as origin point, exposes a resonant transactional modality of understanding space via distancing. In the space we inhabit currently, there are many origin points, as the only point of orientation is the self and the extended nucleus of bodies chosen to group themselves as one. Bodies therefore enter a stage of relational loss with context. In order to navigate, bodies use themselves as parameters, as well as polar coordinates with vectors and distances rather than Cartesian coordinates. In this sense, epidemic space renders correlationism, or the need for embeddedness in the world and the ecosystem, obsolete. Position 3, indoor weather control. If we go back to the 1960s and 1970s, the rise of the bubble cannot be detached from the framework of social and political unrest that rendered cities as dark places of smog, lacking oxygen. It was a project of sovereignty to conquer territories and to control the population that would be shielded inside. The construction of interior weather was on many fronts a cosmological project. This becomes evident if one reflects upon the spectacular posters that Swiss graphic designer Erich Nietzsche drew while working for General Dynamics between 1955 and 1960. In addition to being tasked to popularizing atomic energy and reinventing the company's visual identity as a purveyor of peace, Nietzsche drew a series of posters under the theme to explore the universe, one of which was the poster of weather control. Close to that time, geophysicist and oceanographer Athelstan Spielhaus, who worked with Fuller, worked with a team of urban experts and NASA engineers to plan and implement an experimental city in Minnesota. Alarmed by the growing environmental crisis in America, to Spielhaus's plan, the plan for Minnesota was to build from scratch a large-scale dome city with a passionate conviction that it would eliminate pollution and waste within its perimeter. For Spielhaus, the bubble controlled the weather for the purposes of comfort and leisure, but it also vanquished, and these are his words, the dirty urbanity, the filth, ugliness, and congestion for the entirety of the human race, like a power structure that could maintain and manage constancies over bodies and psyches. It provided a homogenized atmosphere in order to control and predict the behavior and growth in bodies. For the philosopher and physician George Guin-Guillen, it is precisely such a mechanical vision of biology that gives life specifically a modern character. If organisms, either people or plants, are examined explicitly as mechanical structures that serve a physical equilibrium, one cannot account for the complexity, but neither for the beauty of life. Position 4, the allure of comfort, containment as wish fulfillment. The logic of the impenetrable enclosure, with highly regulated and managed airflow, allows the contained subjects to flourish in comfort. The seeds, nevertheless, of Banham's bubble were already present in the arguments of early modernists in the 1940s. Famous American industrial designer George Nelson, for example, wrote about life in a conditioned bubble in his book Tomorrow's House with Henry Wright, written in 1945. He envisioned the house as a perpetually location of camping out in a perfect climate in luxury conditions. In his own words, he identified domesticity as being alone with nature, but in a controlled, comfortable space and integrated into contemporary society by technology. Nelson's ideals did not simply address issues of environmental performance in a collection of devices that needed to be incorporated in living environments. They also forecast a new type of domestic occupation and lifestyle. The house was viewed as the replacement mechanism of urbanity. It was an island of internal isolated comfort, detached from the tissue of urban life. Inside, it could simulate on its walls Caribbean sceneries or cosmic dust, much like a spaceship. What is significant to observe is that such ideas anchored the body inside a self-contained enclosure, and at the same time, this enclosure was promoted beneficial for environmental purposes. One could argue that the long-standing American need for individualization found home in the astronaut's capsule, an introspective bubble absolved from the city and its discontents. Life could now be reinvented with long leisure time at home. Today, the reality of containment is the only reality we experience, as an eerie wish fulfillment that has been vividly illustrated in the architectural dream of the bubble, accelerated with the pandemic. Living indoors, delimited and synced, was already a prevalent mode of experiencing the world before the pandemic. In fact, according to a 2018 Indoor Air Quality Report for the Environmental Protection Agency, Americans already spent 90% of their time indoors. Inside, the need to connect online has been the most vital, a definitive priority in comparison to air quality. This state of willful closure, enhanced by communication technologies, is critiqued by Jonathan Crary in his thesis that our ability to work anywhere at any moment in time has disintegrated all barriers between life, labor, and leisure. For Crary, intentional connectivity throughout the day and night has demonstrated the dehumanizing conditions of neoliberalism, the nonstop marketplace, and the demands for constant productivity and attentiveness. These conditions have reshaped notions of temporality, escalating the management and surveillance of individual bodies across territories. Today, the first line of defense is to stay at home. Yet this moment has already happened. Then why are we so eager to return to an allegedly long normalcy and quickly fall back to a voluntary amnesia? To address containment, a new kind of criticism is needed. New ways to fathom architectural legacies of interiorization, climatic control, and fear of infection. For the reality of the inside is also generating its own hysteria. In all likelihood, Banham's bubble has already come back to bite us. Beyond isolation, containment, and shielding, we need bubbles to burst and bodies to unpack and reconfigure ourselves among pollution and infection. As a famous movie line suggests, open your eyes to the bubble within which you're voluntarily contained. Then develop an erotic yet resistant relationship with your containment. In that way, it might be possible to penetrate barriers and imagine other ways of being. Thank you.
So already some of my favorite topics have come up. Bubbles and the desert and telescopes. But today I'm going to be talking about something else. And I wanted to first thank the organizers for including me in this event. I'm very grateful for it. So the work that I have conducted on Rainer Banham over the last decade has focused more or less directly on some of the issues that came up in the keynote lecture last night. Banham's interest in the manufacture of the image at the same time as he was entirely aware of its manufactured nature, his hands-on approach to the study of architectural objects, his notion of objects in their environment, and how that was brought together in a cinematographic approach towards documentation. And all of this descended from work that I did previously on archigram and the subject of mobility. What is it that moves? Who is the body that inhabits space? Who has the privilege of stasis? So all of these questions are very important to me. And there's a personal angle too, because I applied for the position that I inhabit in Buffalo because it had been Banham's, and because I loved Banham's book from his sojourn here, A Concrete Atlantis. And along with that job, I also inherited a box that is full of things that Banham left behind, including his Rolodex, letters of recommendation that were written for him for the job at Buffalo, teaching materials, and other miscellaneous. Banham came to Buffalo in 1976 at the behest of the dean at the time, Harold Cohen, who had taught alongside Buckminster Fuller and John McHale in Carbondale, Illinois. And Cohen was trying to reassemble a kind of like-minded crowd at SUNY, though that effort never truly saw fruition, partly because John McHale passed away and Buckminster Fuller didn't arrive. But Banham did come and taught in what was then the Art and Architecture Department until 1980, when he moved on to the Department of Art History at the University of California, Santa Cruz, for personal reasons that had to do with Mary Banham's inability to get around in snowstorms. And so for my talk today, which I have entitled Cropping the View, I would like to make a case for the methodological relevance of what Banham attempted, and maybe to appeal to his propensity to see his role as an architectural historian as that of a public intellectual. Now, in some places, perhaps not in this particular venue, it still needs to be stated, right, that the history of architecture is not neutral, and any air of lingering air, right, of archival detachment is just that. And the deployment of architectural history in Buffalo, an industrial city where a long durée of fiscal and racial and ethnic ghettoization has stranded some 30% of the population below the poverty line, demonstrates how scholarship has been used to justify policies that have reified segregation. The co-option of cultural capital by politicians, by developers, is very easy to identify here. And it is less clear how disciplinary resources have been redirected and how they might be galvanized, repurposed to stem the growing tide of spatial injustice. The contrast between the sort of nitty-gritty aspects of the Buffalo landscape and the abstraction of its architecture into an aesthetic discourse was, of course, the project that was begun by the British historian and critic who taught at the State University of New York here from 1976 to 1980. And that project, with its hints of alternative courses for architectural history, remains unfinished. Professional historians of Buffalo's built environment have kind of traditionally fallen into two categories, two discursive trajectories. The dominant one tends to amplify what is known about the city during the period that it attracted prominent American architects to build structures significant enough to be regarded as pivotal to the development of their oeuvre and modern typologies. The alternative course embarks on the other end of the built spectrum, compiling the scholarly case for the lowly buildings of American industrial architecture, of the kind that has a rich heritage in Buffalo. The second trend got its momentum from Banham's teaching and his publications in Buffalo and on Buffalo, and is predominantly focused on the very conspicuous collection of mostly defunct grain silos that stand on the riverfront and in its daylight factories. While the silo in any of its material iterations is not a local product, the upright conveyor belt outfitted with scoops that was used to hoist grain from the hold of boats and to deposit it at the top of the storage silo is said to have first been assembled by a Buffalo entrepreneur in 1842. And this mechanical apparatus already had social implications. It displaced labor, the labor of Irish stevedores who hauled grain on their backs out of the holds of ships. Humans, however, were slow and unpredictable, and agriculture was a big business. And so the grain elevator, as that vertical configuration came to be called, greatly expedited the flow of grain from the Midwest to the marketplaces of the East. And of course, as we know, those purest rows of concrete cylinders suited the needs of European modernists, especially after the publication of Towards an Architecture, when Le Corbusier famously used these structures to illustrate his universal assertions. Most famously, our eyes are made to see forms in light, light and shade reveal those forms, cubes, cones, and spheres, etc. Le Corbusier's conclusion was that the inferior work of American architects should be passed over in favor of the honest labor of engineers in order to extract principles of a new architecture. The very fact that these structures had been generated by subjecting grain and the behavior of under pressure to the needs of transshipment, rather than by recourse to bygone conventions of architectural composition, purified them from the contamination of style. Accordingly, structures of kind of pedestrian origin were elevated from their status of mechanical contraptions to generators of aesthetic discourse. In other words, the low became the high. So in the arc of history, architecture in Buffalo has been positioned within a framework of a national and even international discourse in which value has accrued to it through affiliation with and cultivation of aesthetic discourse. Given the visible ways in which historical research has been put to work, why is it that it is so hard to divert the course of scholarship from this steady enterprise of reifying divisions of an already segregated urban fabric? For one thing, architectural historians have focused, for the most part, on objects, and that which fell outside this purview was often invisible, and more damagingly dismissed often by established academics, like Nicholas Pevsner, entrusted with the cultivation of the next generation of researchers. There were also uncommon figures in the field, like Banam, whose body of work proved an exception to this methodological rule. Now, when people from outside of Buffalo consider Banam's American work, they usually are familiar with his writings on Los Angeles and his interest in arid landscapes. But Banam, of course, left his very coveted job at the University College of London for one in Buffalo, and at least until those family considerations necessitated a move, it was in Buffalo that his work in both subject matter and procedure started to resonate outside of the echo chamber that was the London alternative scene. So a kind of displacement, a displacement from the center, was, after all, Banam's intellectual comfort zone. He had begun his career writing about subjects that were marginalized by the historical literature and stranded in its blind spots. So whether he was exposing avant-garde voices that were suppressed or musing on the impact of air conditioning, he was looking at the periphery and the implications of lingering there. And he championed the cause of information and digital technology already in the late 50s, including the promotion of practices like archograms, that positioned the provincial as a viable source of knowledge. Moreover, he sidelined himself from the mainstream by engaging his fascination with American popular and technological culture, despite a suspicion of such Americanism that was prevalent in the left-leaning intellectual environment of post-war Britain. And his use of the informal tone in the bulk of his writing, as well as seeking out a scope of a public that addressed a range of venues in which his essays appeared, further compounded the accessibility intended by his message. The subject and matter and the style then that Banham used provided at least the appearance of an insider's model to the outside for those seeking to avoid the conventional economy of knowledge. But most significantly was the belief in the potential for history to be practiced in opposition to and as a critique of mainstream discourse. This could be discerned in Banham's writing from the very beginning of his career. This capacity was rooted in Banham's approach to documentation as a mutable entity to which the historian only added more layers through the act of interpretation. Banham, who was an avid photographer himself, was particularly interested in the subjective role played by photography in the construction of history. He writes about this quite a few times in various places. Unlike a drawing, of course, the photograph posed as a passive record. It didn't reveal itself as a composition, and that composition is what it really was. So when Banham notes in one of his first essays that refers to the subject of photography, he says, "The veracity of the camera is proverbial, but nearly all proverbs take a one-sided view of life. We tend to forget that every photograph is an artifact, a document recording forever, a momentary construction based upon reality." This is the continuation of the quote that Tony shared last night that came from Banham's article in the Architectural Review on the Parallel of Life and Art exhibition of 1953 by some of the independent group participants. So lest we think that the implication of this elision of construct and reality was restricted to the realm of scholarly discourse, Banham concluded that photography's, quote, strong moral claims to truth and objectivity, now over a century old, have established its manner of seeing as the currency of our time, and we come to think of the photographic experience as the equivalent of personal participation. The passage of 60 years has only exaggerated the correspondence in the public eye of the photograph, right, as participation. Its manner of seeing is the currency of social media. So since Banham knew of Buffalo's architecture first through photographs, he was particularly interested in what coming to Buffalo would provide him, and he was revealed upon his arrival that experience was the perfect foil to expand on a dialectic of composition versus empirical reality. A Concrete Atlantis, which was published in 1986, the book that Banham published based on his experiences in Buffalo, targeted the representational means through which buildings were co-opted. It wasn't merely that the thesis explored aestheticization of non-architecture. The study itself was demonstrative of generative practices of history. Given the trade photographs of American industrial architecture that were used to substantiate claims of verisimilitude at the heart of the modernist agenda, A Concrete Atlantis reads as a kind of polemic on the uses of documentary distortion. Banham described the use of visual information in foundational texts, and then he himself contributed to that debate with his own practice of historical writing. And then the significance of documentation and the manipulation of its reading becomes intrinsically bound up with how one comes to know about the buildings that he describes and how that affects the information that they ultimately impart. A Concrete Atlantis demonstrates the process that Banham employed to mediate between an antiquarian mode of field research and the archaeology of photographic representation that he deployed in his work. When he arrived in Buffalo, Banham was struck by the immense physicality of the grain silos and compared them with the abstract experience of encountering them as reproductions in modernist manifestos. And the difference between how those silos were understood in images rather than in firsthand experience led Banham to a sustained reflection on how the fact that the conduit by means of which the silos had profoundly influenced the development of a non-industrial architectural aesthetic was a photographic construction. So taking images that were produced by the trade, that were thought to be devoid of contrivances, free of historical trappings, a product of optical science, as Banham writes, supposedly free from the elements of personal selection and interpretation that must inevitably infect any artistic rendering or even the traditional production by architectural draftsmen of finished drawings from field notes. The photographs represented a truth as apparently objective and modern as the structures they portrayed. So a Concrete Atlantis which centers on the non-architecture of labor sparked the interest of architectural tourists and historians in these kinds of buildings because they had inspired the polemics of early modernism, and admittedly Banham was fascinated by that angle too. But Banham's attention lingered at the length of the functional details that were of no consequence to the modernist argument. For example, he researched the mechanics of the grain silos, including the nitty-gritty of their slip-form construction, the workings of their belts and their chutes and pulleys that informed the internal dynamics of these outwardly stoic structures. And in his seminars at SUNY, students participated in the documentation of what he called anonymous works of industrial nature in a very detailed fashion that was usually reserved for structures that had illustrious authors. And in addition to the evidence that was collated by the students, Banham undertook a process of documenting the silos with his own Pentax 35 millimeter SLR camera that he began to use and was dedicated to at that time. And he turned first to the grainy reproductions that he was most familiar with, taking those photographs with him to the site and trying to match the grainy photographs from the modernist texts with what stood before him in the field. And then he photographed that. And the comparisons which documented these transformations of the landscape over time were often described by him in exhaustive detail. So, for example, in the Architectural Review, he wrote about how he went to the site where Mendelssohn took this photograph, and he says, sitting on the end of this massive I-beam that forms part of the chassis of the currently out of service #1 Marine Tower of the Standard Elevator, I can see almost exactly what Erich Mendelssohn saw when he photographed this scene 56 years ago. He could not have sat where I sit. The Standard was not built until 1928. In fact, the photo he took could not be repeated, even given the right width of lens and angle and exact standpoint, because the view is cropped on both sides by the main and subsidiary structures of the standard. So note how he uses the term cropped here and how the view itself has changed due to the accretion of buildings on the ground. Photographs of the silos had already been tweaked, right, by Korb in most famously when he removed the pediments of the Buenos Aires silo towards an architecture. So this kind of whitewashing was already familiar to the architectural historian, but Banham practiced his own version of photographic corrections. Contact sheets in the archive of Patricia Bazelon, who was the photographer he hired to take photographs for Concrete Atlantis, are annotated with Post-it notes that include requests by Banham to have images that had been shot in 35 millimeter film redone in a 4x5 format and vice versa. Banham might have been seeking the advantages of a large format camera to more closely approximate the sensibility of two-point perspective. But of course, that creates a distortion towards the perimeter of the image. And indeed, large format images used in Concrete Atlantis are significantly cropped at their edges, despite the fact that in general, Banham rarely cut photographs. He did not crop any of the 35 millimeter ones, even when Bazelon suggested it. Overt manipulation and the practice of cropping away the undesirable leads to a crucial point: the varying costs of the historical frame. Where Banham resisted the clipping and trimming of images that were made to capture the gist of experience to his mind, the most staged of photographic manipulations, from tampering with the format of the negative to excising unwanted information, these were eligible for adjustment outright. And by contrast, the annexation of the photograph from one context to another, an act of appropriation that was further decontextualized by surreptitious corrections to supposedly neutral images, performed an act of conceptual redlining. While the bias of constructions that pass themselves off as pictures of reality was in itself a subject worthy of meditation, the effort remains incomplete as it stands. Banham, for example, lavished attention on mechanisms, but he did not attend in any meaningful way to the invisible labor that was intrinsic to the workings of these machines, whether it was galvanized in the buildings of the silos or tied to the fate of those who worked in them. A Concrete Atlantis is still a story of buildings whose history has been put to various ends. The adroit levels at which Banham demonstrated the balance of visual record and active participation in the making of history still needs to be extended to other forms of spatial marginalization that directly impact lived experience. Decentralized places and states can, if the opportunity is seized, offer freedoms that are foreclosed upon at the center. And that in itself is a project that is worthy of its endeavor. Thank you.
My thanks to all the panelists. One of my favorite positions to be in as a moderator is to find myself with a healthy ratio of answers to questions at the end of it all. And I appreciate that your papers provided me with such an interesting opportunity to raise a number of different questions in a number of different ways. And in part, I appreciate your perspectives on Banham, because as someone who has taught Banham many times to students who, as the years progress, seem increasingly uncertain about why this person is in front of them, I like to revisit him as well from your perspective. And there's one that I'm really struck by that Hadas raises both at the beginning and the end of her presentation that I thought I might leap off on, which is it is true that notable among Banham's writings, whether you agree with his position or not, is that he did in fact seek out many different topics, sites, and positions that had been overlooked by the architectural press more generally. And while it's true that he wrote for architectural journals and art journals, he also wrote for essentially popular press journals. And there was a sense among those journals that there was value in having someone with his critical eye write for a generalist audience about both famous architecture and unfamous architecture. And he lived in an era where he could propose, I'm going to rent a car in Los Angeles and I need a film crew to film me as I drive around the city. And they would say, that makes sense, let's do it. In our present moment, magazines and newspapers, at least in the United States, are shedding critics at an astronomical rate. And every year I query the incoming group of undergraduate architecture students, who's their favorite architecture critic? And the answer is, what is an architecture critic? And I wonder if you have thoughts about, given that Banham, after a long life of criticism, comes to the conclusion that architecture is, in fact, in some ways still impenetrable, even to him. Is the decline of architectural criticism, at least in the United States, likely to enable architecture as an impenetrable practice, say in the case Hadas raises, to continue to elide responsibility for its role in, say, the evisceration of labor, or in the maintenance of redlining, or in the elision of the sense of what a healthy environment is in the case of Lydia's work, or in John's work? How might the impenetrability remain a concern in the age of, say, the XL Keystone Pipeline, or the fires in Los Angeles last year? So that's just a proposition I throw out to you, and first come, first served on a response.
Well, I'll just briefly, just to get the ball rolling and spark a little conversation, say that though it is interesting to wonder about the relevance of Banham in relation to the pressing questions of the moment. But what I do see of value in his project is what you just pointed to, the desire to speak to many publics about in a language, at least in attempting a language that could be shared, between people reading New Society and people reading the Architectural Review, right? And I think we do not have a lot of public intellectuals of that kind anymore. Why don't students know who the architectural critics who write for the paper are? Because they're not there. It isn't really speaking to them. It's not. And I'm kind of amazed by the effort that Banham put into the language that he used in addressing different kinds of people. If you read, his dissertation versus if you read Well-Tempered Environment, theory and design versus Well-Tempered Environment, what different language he uses to describe air conditioning versus, say, the historical narratives that he unfolds. So I think that in itself, the legacy of the public intellectual and who writes about architecture is one that I think we could redress. That we could think about what that would mean today. Now, I don't think that a public intellectual who was focused on architecture would talk about what Banham spoke about. They would probably be much more interested in what Lydia is describing as the implications of these kinds of conditions, or the technology of, the space program. But the impetus, I guess the relevance for me of what he was doing was more the potential for for the evolution, I suppose, of the role of the critic. I thought I said more than I intended to.
I think this is a very important question, actually, the one that you're raising. And I was actually struck, and that's why I was, I couldn't respond at first. I had to think for a minute, because it is very true. There are no longer, there's no longer the position of the static critic that receives, let's say, a work and then responds to it as a kind of passive medium of cause and effect response. That kind of modality of operating in the world is very much disintegrated. But I think there's something different, and we don't have the words quite to clarify what it is, but we have a lot of, well, I'll use a tentative term, which, we could disagree on happily. The architectural detective, or the forensic analyst, that I think the people that were the intellectuals that would receive a work, read from a kind of passive position and respond to it, have taken on a more enacted role, a kind of activist type of scholarship, where they become investigators of realities that are revealed. And I'm thinking, while I'm saying that, it has nothing to do with Banam, obviously, people like forensic architecture and the group that analyze with great detail. And it's not just them, that they have a kind of very specific agenda of reversing kind of wrongful declaration and of injustice in different kind of events by reconstituting different media. I think there are other practices that are more circulating on the fringes of forensic analysis, even though they're not about forensic architecture, specifically about events like that. So I think that these kind of dichotomies, I think that in many ways the dichotomy that he was seeing in 1960, the one between technology and tradition, the ones that he was so fervently trying to dismantle in many ways, they no longer stand, there are practices of a more intersectional nature, I would call it, and I can't quite find a name for it, but it's a very interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts, since you're raising that question. Why is there such an intense disappearing act of the architectural critic? What happened to, we lost them, right?
Yeah, well, I would say part of it is that Banham could get a job at Buffalo writing what he wrote in a very different sort of labor system for faculty than you might find now. So the idea of having a person who might primarily take that position is one. I mean, the other is a kind of strange economics of it. So the Tribune just decided they'd rather buy out Blair Kamen than continue to pay his salary, because the paper is owned by a hedge fund, and the hedge fund has its vision of what a paper is for, and it's to return a set of profits rather than to produce a set of ideas. And so that entire market shift around what these publications, why they even exist, is part of it. But I think your point is well taken about this sense of a shift to the forensic. And that sort of leads to a second question I kind of had, which is, regardless again of what you think of Banham's writing, he clearly has a profoundly attentive eye. And I'm struck that part of the way he could have that was his thinking and his approach to image making was so relentlessly analog, as of course was only available to him. And I'm always wondering whether he would have been able to have that attentive eye if he had a smartphone. Because the idea when you watch people moving through those landscapes now, or in front of those grain silos, everyone is relentlessly recording it on their camera with images they will never revisit. Right? They will never They will never do contact sheets of their 35 millimeter Pentax where they bracketed each image, at this exposure, then at this exposure, then at that exposure, and then revisit those with that kind of critical eye. They'll take that photo, they'll be filed away among thousands of others, never to be seen again. And I just wonder what your thoughts are. What kind of, if we were to imagine a Banam for 2021, would he be buried under the relentless wave of images that we're all exposed to now, so that no one image ever has the chance perhaps to stand out in the way that one singular photograph that he seeks to find that is ostensibly scientific? Is that even possible now in our image saturated moment?
I think that Banam would probably have written about, he thought different camera, he wrote about different types of cameras a little bit, the Polaroid, the SLR, and he was interested in the different kinds of views that they provided. So I imagine that he would have had a lot to say about the different cameras of various iPhones. And, I was thinking in relation to John, what John was, so when he writes about photographing the desert, he writes very differently about that experience than, say, when he was photographing the buildings of industrial heritage. It's a very interesting, actually, piece in the archive at the Getty. It's not a published piece about photographing the desert that John probably knows, and I feel like he was highly aware of the criteria that each apparatus contained within it, and what it curtailed and what it didn't. Like in the cover of the Scenes from America Deserted that he gave to Magda Mikhail, he wrote, "You'll see this book is in something entirely different than what I usually, what you're used to." What is it that he thought was entirely different about that book? And I think it has to do with the visuality of his experience of expanse and his way of recording that expanse. So maybe what I'm saying is not so much lost, but highly aware that these new tools completely changed how you might construct reality.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, Hadas. The really profound point of your paper about how the camera and the archive and all of that kind of stuff and distorting things, and I think he does the same thing in the desert too. Like his religious experiences in the desert. They're really close. Like the way he describes them is he uses biblical language and they're very tongue in cheek about it. But there is something about the way that those visual experiences kind of bend his reality or bend his perception of what could possibly happen in the future. And Benjy, when you were talking about what he would say nowadays with an iPhone, I think that, yeah, he loved technology. He absolutely loved it. It was a big part of what he envisioned the future to be, and that it was really something that we needed to accept or embrace or have fun with. But then I wonder about what he would think about Elon Musk. And I think that there would be I don't know. The Protestantism in the desert, I think, is significant. Is that there's really that purity, the shornness of kind of all sorts of clutter, the asceticism of the entire thing is a big part of the potency of the project. And I think that ability to have a transporting experience, he would find troubling that that's not available nowadays in the proliferation of all sorts of other stuff. And so I can't imagine him, also can't imagine him finding a market to be critical of, Elon Musk saying we need to dig car tunnels under LA. I think that he would find that to be kind of silly and frustrating, as opposed to getting at what he found so amazing about the Kitts Peak experience, that he wouldn't find that a Tesla to him is not, it doesn't achieve the same kind of idea that he's going for.
It's funny you should raise Tesla, because I was wondering in my mind whether he would have driven one in LA or whether he would have found it too soulless in some ways. The other thing I'm struck by is that, admittedly, Banham is looking at the U.S. when the kind of Rust Belt decline in Buffalo certainly had already begun. But nevertheless, in terms of overall infrastructure, the U.S. was still very much enjoying the tail end of those sort of 2.5 decades of post-war monumental investment in grand-scale infrastructure, which we have not seen really in the last 30 or 40 years. Every year, the American Society of Civil Engineers comes out with a ranking of American infrastructure, and they always, for the last decade and a half, maybe longer, it's been a D-. And that's sort of, I think, because they're not willing to give us an F, because it's too politically loaded. And I wonder if in part that heroicization of infrastructure and technology that he has is still possible when we know that even in ostensibly the wealthiest nation in the world, we're no longer able to maintain our infrastructure. We can't roll out a vaccine reliably. We can't build a website that won't crash to let you schedule the vaccine. So I wonder if that optimism that he had around that is something you see reflected in, say, the next generation of students coming through your classrooms that are being exposed to Banham's kind of views on this, or whether you find that that's a moment that has passed and is purely historical.
Well, I would say I think Banham really liked to fail when technology failed. Like, if you think about how you write the article that, I guess, the one with Dallegray in the bubble, right? He talks in it about the creaking of the sounds of inflatable. Like, he liked the physicality and also the possibility that the whole thing could implode in a second. Like with Barbarella, or like the fact that the computer malfunctions in 2001, like all of that stuff he really loved. So I feel like he did have a fascination with technology, but he also knew that it was not teleologically driven to improve things, right? And I think he wouldn't have driven a Tesla because it didn't look like an American car. Like, he wanted to drive a Cadillac with fins. Like, he didn't want to drive a European-looking thing, So he reveled in I think his contradictions, and that's the kind of stuff I like about Banham more than, say, seeing him as a techno prophet or kind of foreshadowing of the digital present. I think he's more interesting for me when he talks about the stuff that kind of malfunctions and doesn't make people, it is uncomfortable, when he makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he's all about what it is to live with these things and to be out there and do part of it. And that's a big part of that aesthetic experience for him is the imperfectibility of the world, because he nothing would be interesting in a perfect world for him. And but I think that he is interested in like the potential of places, and America, post-war America, is the place where all sorts of stuff is happening that it sets off all of the the fireworks in his brain. And I mean, that's why he makes a film about LA, and he points to it. It's like this is the place where a culmination is happening, like where the conditions are being met, which that to me is the interesting thing for being a historian, to go and point to something that's happening. It's not something that I do in my practice. I work in the 19th century, but that he could do that and be looking for that, where in all of its fits and starts and imperfections is, it's a really fascinating thing about looking at the world, not just as a historian, but as a person, to go and be in the place where stuff is happening, just to be there. I think that's really relevant to our students, I think.
Todd, I know we're at time, but did you perhaps want to throw in a final query or provocation for our guests?
I could continue to have this conversation for quite a long time, I think. But I'm struck by the way the 19th century seems to be creeping into this conversation. Whether it's there's a kind of the search for these sublime aesthetic experiences. Banam on the molten bike is downright Victorian in its kind of creaky steel structure, the Englishness of Banam, which was something that he really combated in his early years, in taking on the elder generation, whether it be Pevsner or Hastings or the general editorial position of the Architectural Review. It's quite interesting to see how those very English positions seem to still, inhabit his work. He can't use them in England, but they become very useful in the Mojave Desert or in Buffalo or on the LA freeways. And I'm not sure that that's been pointed out before, but it does seem like something that this conversation is teasing out of the literature. I think it's really, I should look at that camera. It is really, I thought it was just great to see the range of work that came up today. I think that the archival photographs from Buffalo are really fantastic. I've had the great pleasure of crawling around in Silo City myself, and it's a blast. And it's funny that it looked like that in the 80s, because it looks like that today. And I admit I went there with aesthetic ambitions. Not, I wasn't there to figure out how the machinery worked. I was there to be in those spaces because of their sublime kind of romantic qualities. And so I think that this has been a really great addition to the conversations that we started last night. I'm very much looking forward to this continuing on this weekend. We'll be back Saturday, this same URL at 1:00 Eastern time. And so I hope I'll see all of you and more of you there or here or wherever we are as we reconstruct realities through moving images. But please join us again then. Thank you very much to everyone that participated today, Hadas, John, Lydia, and Benjy. I think this has really been a lot of fun, and I learned a lot. So thanks very much, and we'll see you all soon.